Hi, Christine. Very pleased to talk to you again. And from the first moment I was thinking about this exhibition, your name was on my list of artists. I was thinking about maybe even showing the work Nap Disturbance, which I saw at Frieze Art Fair in 2016, which of course already predestines the work in its title for an exhibition which is about moving images, sound, language and music. And because this also implies the question for sound pollution. And the work is very much about controlling sound, controlling movements, but also respect for the environment and for others. Maybe you can give us a little introduction into this work.
So I'll say that how I came up with the idea initially comes back to some of the experiences I'd had at home. So my partner is hearing, and he was working the overnight shifts. So he would typically take an afternoon nap before he went off to work. But he would take his naps on the couch in the living room. And for me, whenever he took a nap, what that meant to me is that I'd have to be quiet. But that's the kind of quiet you'd expect to do it in the evening time, not in the afternoon. And so I turned that into this project, this piece. And so I worked with a few deaf friends of mine. We went to Frieze and we decided to establish some choreography. And we had the idea of polite movements and not so polite movements. So the movements would be like moving a chair, which is universal, right? But we would do it politely, which is quietly. Then we do it not so politely, which is to drag it loudly across the floor. And so that's how this piece came together. But then when I was thinking about what we should wear, chroma green came to mind. And so we ended up getting these sweatshirt hoodies that we would fasten the hood to our heads, and by being in head to toe chroma green, our body parts would stick out a little bit more. And so the idea is that we were supposed to be able to blend in, but the green really made us stand out instead. And I also decided to use household objects for that piece. So cups and plates, things that you use at home and that ultimately experienced some wear and tear during the piece performances.
You're an artist, but you're also an activist for American Sign Language. And in Magical Soup we have 13 smaller drawings and 3 larger drawings. Could you please tell us a little bit maybe how this works differ? And maybe we start with these 2 larger ones, the Star Spangled Banner and the America the Beautiful, which refers to your experience when you performed the national anthem at this year's Super Bowls in Miami.
Experience at Super Bowl was kind of, an unbelievable moment. For me, that required a lot of planning. There was a lot of emotional kind of check-ins I had to do. So the National Association for the Deaf, NAD, they choose a deaf member or a deaf a member of the deaf community, to be somebody who represents us on a national level. I was asked for this year's Super Bowl, but I was struggled because I was considering the reputation of the NFL and Black Lives Matter. And you mentioned that I'm known as an activist, but I struggled with that at first because I grew up, you know, with a small group of people, and a lot of the expectations is that we become activists and teachers, and I've kind of struggled with that expectation because I, you know, thought I wanted to be just an artist as in a typical sense. But in the past few years, it's been really important for me to be an activist, and I found a way to be an artist and an activist. With the Super Bowl offer, I was also contacted by the New York Times to write an op-ed, and I thought that that was a solution I could find peace with, basically a solution I wanted to accept, because I had that moment on the field, but I also then had a moment to kind of say more about the platform through the New York Times. So I worked with Beth, actually, and her and I practiced, and she cued me to let me know when the singer was at what note. And so I worked on translating the song into ASL. Now, with every performer that the NAD has brought to sign these two songs, each performer has done their own translation. So I've done my own translation, and then I performed it at the Super Bowl. But after the Super Bowl was done, I was still thinking about my ASL translation, because I thought about how I took a piece that I accessed in written English, I turned it into American Sign Language, and then I wanted to essentially translate it to a third modality. And so what I did is turned it into drawings. And musical notation is something that's very common in my practice. And so I wanted to find a way to have this notational drawing of an ASL translation of the song in English, America the Beautiful, and the Star Spangled Banner.
So the second series of drawings we are showing here are the smaller drawings, which I think show even more how your conceptual thinking of sound is. Maybe you could explain one or two of them and tell us a little bit more about your idea of sound.
So there is a system of how you can identify a full note, a half note, a quarter note, and a 16th note. And so it's a system that I connected to, and it was a way to express the rhythm of those notes. And so I took that system and wanted to apply it to thoughts and feelings. So when Germany went into lockdown, I had thought a lot about my internet experiences, right? Because that's all we had at home, right? I was online all day, every day, because we needed information to be able to understand, you know, what the fuck was going on, right? What the future was going to look like. How do I get food? Is there enough water for everyone? These kind of questions I was asking myself. And so then it turned into this series, and I'll focus on two drawings. So I've noticed in my art process a lot of the times is that I have an idea, a full note, right? And then I go down to a half note, get it into its state. And then I get into, you know, a quarter note, which is like my mood. And then I'm kind of mooding through it, right? And so the idea is like I kind of have 4 different moods as I go through that process. And then a 16th note is post. And then I'm posting and posting and posting, right? Because it's after the idea has been done. And I don't mean post as in Instagram. I mean like it is after the thought has come into fruition. So I'm done, 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 done. I'm just saying post, 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 post. And then to take this similar hierarchy to the other drawing that I'd like to talk about is this one. And this has to come with my experiences on Twitter. So I was scrolling on Twitter a lot, and it's so mentally exhausting. And what I would find is like I'd read a post, and then I'd kind of like decide my stance, and then I'd retweet it, and then I'd be like, wait, no, I didn't mean to retweet that, and then I'd delete it, right? And so it shows that reading is the longest time, and then I would skim, so that was a little bit less time. Then I would retweet even more, if you will, and then it wasn't to the end that I would, in, you know, fervent haste, want to quickly delete those posts as much as possible. And so that's my experience on Twitter. if I think about it in the context of fake news, right? So there's stuff that comes out that people say, yes, this is true, this actually happened, right? And then we realize that no, this didn't actually happen. This was something that was based on assumptions. And then because of that, people get defensive and start accusing. So then there's accusations. And then eventually people just kind of accept it as like, this has happened, whatever. There's no accountability, and people just move on to the next thing. And that's what I'm seeing, is that there's been a lot where news comes out, news goes through the cycle, and news gets moved on from, but there's not a lot of accountability for what everyone just went through with that news cycle. And I feel like that's kind of how we're seeing news operate at this point in time.
So maybe we can talk about this work as well, which is, I think, something which is very relevant right now. So why did you do a work about presidency right now?
As I'm sure you're well aware, the United States is a mess. And there's a lot of questions of asking ourselves, what does the presidency even mean? So being here in Germany, I saw a video of Angela Merkel sitting, and she was just so calmly explaining the rules in a very presidential way. And to me, I thought that's what presidents should be like, and that's what presidency should look like. So that's why it says presidency, and then it says address, and then it says media. And for me, that video of Merkel, I wasn't able to access until after, with it being captioned. And I think a lot of times we've seen, regardless of what country, a lot of times there are addresses to the nation, to the country, to the people. And deaf people don't get the information until afterwards. And I almost wish it was presidency, captions, address, then press. But you see, accessibility is typically is the last prioritized, or it gets deprioritized. And so the deaf community, and their access rather, is an afterthought, and it's not normally part of the initial structure or the initial system or process, and rather is always an afterthought. And so the captions, being a 16th note, express that.
So maybe, can you tell us the difference between captions and maybe subtitles? So what is exactly the meaning of captions?
So I chose the word caption because there is a difference between captions and subtitles for this piece. Subtitles will mostly cover the dialogue, what's being said, basically anything that came out of a person's mouth, whereas captions actually include contextual information, sounds as well, and will let you know that like the phone is ringing in the background, whereas subtitles wouldn't do that. And so I do want to acknowledge that historically those two things have always been very different. Like if you went to see a foreign film subtitled, they wouldn't tell you in the subtitles that the phone was ringing. But if you went to go see a film with captions, that you would have information like the phone is ringing and things like that, because they weren't just focusing on dialogue, they were adding environmental sounds. Now there's been less of a difference, and I think that people kind of use the words a little bit more interchangeably, and so there hasn't been, it's not so easily to distinguish for a lot of people the way it used to be.
I learned that you got the idea to do something with sound when you came to Berlin. How was that?
So what I will say is I went to school, the School of Visual Arts in New York for my first MFA. And when that was done, I was a bit naive, kind of asking myself like, okay, now I have an MFA, aren't I an artist? But nothing was really happening. So I just kind of started doing odd jobs, and I heard about a residency in Berlin, and thank goodness for that friend, because they were really insistent on me coming. So I came for a month. And for me, it was really life-changing, because in New York, everything's so crowded, everything's so quick, everything's so vertical, space is so precious. But being here in Berlin, I felt like there was a lot more space, which then allowed me to physically move my ideas and concepts around. I think when you find that your mental space gets expanded, well, then that lets a little bit more space for things to enter in your head and in your mind. And so then I could finally have some room to start thinking about sound. Mind you, I've known and not known about sound my whole life. And I just started asking myself, like, well, why couldn't I work with sound? My gut response was to say, no, of course you can't. I felt like I might lose my identity, especially my cultural identity and my relationship with the deaf community. I thought if I went into sound that would compromise it. But then I also thought about it again, and I realized that I've given so much control over sound to others, especially to hearing people. And I asked myself, why can't I assert my viewpoint on sound? And so that's what I did. And I established my own rules around sound, my own ideas and concepts. And I've now gotten to a point where I can say, hey, sound means ice cream. And people will be like, yes. And I think that's really cool.
And I read a blog where Jerry Salt says, impressed by Christine as well, that every child should learn at least 150 signs in school, which I think is a brilliant idea because it's always good for brain evolvement and also connecting the visual with the hearing.
I agree, but I also have seen in the United States, there's a lot of teaching the alphabet and the numbers. And I know that they did that a lot when we were, school aged. But I find that now when I go to the United States, there are hearing people who say, oh, I know sign language, and they'll know the alphabet and they'll know their numbers. And a lot of that comes from us teaching it in schools when they were so young. And I think it's a beautiful thing. For me, it's really important that people have at least a little bit of awareness or understanding of deafness, maybe know a deaf person or two, at least see deaf people in the media. I think that representation helps non-deaf people know that deaf people exist, right? And if we are known to exist, then we can be considered for laws. We can be considered as a community and as a presence. I'm always thinking long term. And I think that it's really nice to have sign language considered early on because incrementally it leads us to the future that we'd like to see.
So I also learned through your works a lot about the different concepts of silence. So for example, there is the silence which is conceived by John Cage, which always needs sound to be defined as silence. But there are also different forms of silence. And I learned a lot about this musical sign for P for piano, which you worked a lot with. Maybe you can discuss with us a little bit about, or talk about your idea of silence.
Sure, I'll start with Bard College. For me, that was kind of the place where I learned a lot of history, theory, discourse around sound as an art form. And before that, I had applied and luckily I'd gotten in, but it was kind of my first step into sound art. And at Bard, that's where I learned about John Cage because it's kind of a clear figure to look at to learn more about sound art. I think that John Cage showed me what was possible, right? He broke all of those musical rules that had been in place for centuries, right? He showed me that music has notation and that notes could be silent. For me, that was new. And when I read his book, Silence, I actually couldn't relate. Like I read it and I tried my best, but this is when I realized that hearing people use sound to measure silence and the other way around, right? They use silence to measure sound. But I had to ask myself, well, what do I want to use, right? I know hearing people's silence well, but I wanted to find my own form of silence. There's so many kinds of silence, and so I wanted to find mine. And for me, I find that silence can be quite hostile. It can be suffocating. It feels like a white noise concept to me. And so I thought a lot about that. And in that process of thinking about it, it kind of led me to musical notes. And when I discovered piano, that notation means that you play the note quietly. And I thought about it that if there were more pianos, pianissimo, and so on, then it seems like there's actually never a full silence, right? And so then I had to ask myself, well, what does that look like? And I kind of became obsessed with that idea, because when I think about my relationship with interpreters, it's a similar concept. I have been fortunate to have a core team of interpreters who travel the world with me. When I go to the United States, that's where they are as well. And so I feel like I, as a person, my voice exists as a music note, right? And I then put it on the score, and I trust the interpreter to decide what to do with the note. So they'll make me sound smart or not, or sad or happy, right? They can play that note however they wish. And so the interpreter essentially decides the musical dynamics. And I think that that's maybe why I was able to connect with that concept so well, because it's something I've had in my own lived experience.
If we do an artist talk, we always would work with your preferred interpreters, which today is Beth, and maybe you could also talk a little bit about the selections of interpreters you have, because you have your group of interpreters who are also your friends right now, and this would be also interesting for us to know the differences.
So in traveling for giving talks and things like that, I've found that I don't always know the local interpreters. So I started out working that way, right? If I went to New York, I'd work with interpreters in New York. If I went somewhere else, I'd work with the interpreters who were there. And I found that to be almost disempowering. It's exhausting. I don't know the interpreters and how to work with them just yet. And there's a lot of specific lingo and jargon in my work. And so what that meant is if I hadn't worked with them before, I would have to sit down with them in advance. It would take a lot of time for me to explain my work, to get them up to speed, right, to figure out how to best voice me. But so I did that process. And in that process, I found who I connected with, who was able to kind of keep up and things like that. And that's how I've gotten down to my core team. Beth, for example, is somebody I've worked with for many years. So we know the right language, we know she knows the right things to say, she reflects my humor quite well. And this being a video interview, this is something that will reside eternally, right, on the internet. And so I've picked my interpreters based on their willingness, if you will, and their availability as well. But in Europe, for me, my experience has been different, right? I know basic DGS, German Sign Language, but not enough to work in German Sign Language and get the full information. There are some American Sign Language interpreters that reside here in Europe, but we're either not a good fit personality-wise or background-wise, and that they don't necessarily always have my work. There's one interpreter in London who I do have the chance to work with, but part of it is that every country has their own different accessibility laws, and some partially follow those laws, some fully follow those laws, some don't have any laws. And the US has been really great about the accessibility law aspect. Europe and the European countries are not exactly there just yet in comparison to the United States. So then I have to ask myself if I'm able to bring my American expectations to European context. I don't necessarily think so. I think that European countries work differently, right? And they're all different. And how do I navigate that system, right? So I have my interpreters, I have workarounds. I still also work in the United States a lot. And so I'm able to kind of go back to the way I was raised, if you will. But also I have to figure out how to work with interpreters here in Germany. And something else I'd like to add as well is that it's honestly impossible to find an interpreter who suits me for every situation, who's really good in social settings, for artist talks, for a doctor's appointment, right? A lot of interpreters specialize in certain fields. And my thing is like, I love to talk and I love to socialize, and not all interpreters have the skill to kind of keep up with my pace of conversation.
I would like to also take this as an opportunity to maybe talk about your work, which is Tables and Windows from 2016, which also refers to the lack of ability of non-deaf students to describe objects and rooms. So maybe we could talk about this work. I also saw your work Classified Digits and Looky Tom from 2018, where you collaborated with your life partner, Thomas Marder. Maybe you can talk a little bit about these collaborations with Thomas.
So my partner, Tom, we are now married. He is my husband. And I think it's been about 7 or 8 years that we've created work together. And a lot of the inspiration came from when we were first dating. Tom had to learn sign language. So we had miscommunications because, right, I have American culture, he has German culture, I have deaf culture, he has hearing culture. There's a lot of cultural overlaps there. And so we had to kind of figure out how to communicate with each other, right? And so that's when we kind of came up with the helping hands game, where one person puts their hands behind their back and the person behind puts their hands through. And we use that to kind of work together. And what he would do with his hands is establish the context and the environment, and I would have to respond to it. So then for Tables and Windows, we agreed that when you were describing a table and a window, right, in order to do that, you have to kind of envision what that space where the table and window are and what that looks like. So we use that, but in sign language. And what's nice is you can use signs to kind of paint a picture of the table or of the window. And you can use your face to indicate, is that texture smooth? Is that texture rough? Is that object close? Is that object far? And if you didn't have any facial expressions, then you would lose the entire description of the object. So this is a table. This is a smooth surface table, right? Because I'm showing that it's smooth in my face. This is maybe a rugged surface. And so then this also tells you the shape and the depth of the object. And so by showing different facial expressions, it expresses different features of the object. And the same goes for a window. And part of that idea also came from a friend of mine who teaches German Sign Language here in Germany, and said that a lot of their students struggle to understand those grammatical features in sign language because they understood that they could express a window, right? And typically they would just show that it's a square window and it's got glass. But as a signer, native signer, I would show that it was square. I would show the panes. I would show how you open it, right? Like, because I'm native, I use my facial expressions to show the details. And it was in that conversation with my friend who teaches sign language and the experiences with Tom that we came up with Tables and Windows.
So in Magical Soup, we are also showing your work, Metro Lullaby. Could you please maybe tell a little bit more about Metro Lullaby and what this is about, this work?
So Metro Lullaby came, or rather was inspired by a TV show that's on Amazon called Handsland, which was created by a group of deaf people in the United States. So there's no attachment to hearing lyrics, right? Because I feel like a lot of times whenever there's something in English, the translation into ASL is kind of being thought of as something that has to match the original English translation. Handsland doesn't do that. Handsland just goes straight to ASL and also offers different rhythms and lyricism in that. So in ASL, there are 5 different hand shapes. And so you can see where I write CL, which means classifier, that indicates which hand shape is being used. And so in regards to what it's like to go on a daily walk, right? This is a sign for Monday. You're walking along and you spot. And the way that that comes off in ASL loaned English is I spot, right? And so you can use this one hand shape to create a whole story. Right, so I'm doing one, and then I'm saying mouse ran along. And so as I was walking, I saw 2, and then the number 2 turns into different signs as well, but keeping the same hand shape. Raccoons running. 3, roosters using their claws to walk. 4 was bears walking together. 5, and then you can use the hand shape for deer running in a pack. And so it's really interesting is you can use one hand shape but create a full sentence from it in sign language. And then for Saturday and Sunday, you say that you're not going for a walk, you rest. And so that's the lullaby. And I turned it into a drawing. And I used a similar concept to what I did for the Star Spangled Banner and for America the Beautiful. And admittedly, I'm not really big on translating songs, but these 3 just really have a moment with me and something that really kind of compelled me to turn them into drawings.
So maybe we could also talk a little bit about your work, One Week of Lullabies for Rue, which was acquired by the Smithsonian Art Institute recently. Yeah.
So yes, I'm so excited that the Smithsonian Institute of American Art acquired their first piece of sound art, and it's mine. I admittedly thought they would choose some like white hearing guy, but no, they picked me. And so that was really exciting for me. And the idea behind it came from when my baby was born. As all parents do, you need to know if they're crying. And so I needed to find a baby monitor, and I found one that suited my needs. And so there was one monitor that we kept in her room and one monitor that we would have with us as parents. And so if she cried, the lights would flash and I would know that she was crying. But I also noticed that there were some preloaded popular baby lullabies that if my baby is crying, I could just push a button and the lullaby would play, and the idea is that she'd go back to sleep. But I didn't really like that. I didn't want to bring too much more sound into our lives and into our home. I don't know the lyrics of these lullabies, right? So I decided to create my own. So I established a score and some rules, like it had to have no lyrics, low frequency, and I contacted artist friends of mine who were also parents, and I asked them to create a lullaby. And I got 7 lullabies back, which, you know, is a week's worth of lullabies, and I made them for Rue. And so you can go and see the sound exhibition and put on headphones and hear each of the 7 lullabies. And every lullaby also has its own description to it as well, which for me makes the piece conceptually accessible for people like myself.
The attributes like deaf or American Asian or female or mother, artist, activists, do any of these attributes in a way describe your identity? Could you connect to them in a way, or none of them?
Political identities in the United States is a really big discussion, and so I think that's been an important thing for me to convey. I find it less relevant in European context. People don't want to discuss it as much, but in the US it's really in your face, almost a little bit too much. And so I feel like sometimes it's a bit of a game, right? Like sometimes I allow myself to be labeled because that's kind of been my experience growing up. I was labeled as deaf, right? So then I was told that these are the ways in which I should behave as a deaf person. And so I feel like in some ways I am reclaiming my identity through my work. But yes, I do struggle sometimes. Sometimes I just want to be Christine as Christine, but people look at me and they see different things, right? Maybe in a European context, people notice that I'm Asian first. And then when I start signing, people realize I'm deaf. And so I think sometimes it's good to kind of acknowledge my identities, get it out of the way, right? Acknowledge the elephant in the room and kind of claim them so that we can move on from them.
So maybe we could discuss about this, your project, which is Deaf Power. I try to do it again to motivate people on Instagram to vote. And who are your allies? Who are you working with? Can you maybe talk a little bit about this campaign?
So my amazing friend from Australia, his name is Ravi Vasavan, and he's a graphic designer. I'm an artist. And so we met and hit it off. And we were just talking about how we wanted to see more collaboration in the deaf community, because a lot of the deaf communities in different countries are dwindling. And so we think it's really important to kind of cross borders and make the deaf community as big as we can, not just within our own countries. So we wanted to figure out a way to kind of express the pride that we feel in being deaf. And so we set up the Instagram account. We also have a few projects that we're thinking of, but we use this Instagram account to kind of test the waters, so to speak. We wanted to see if we would get submissions and engagement, and it's gone pretty well. Like, we have bags and we have face masks, and it's a way to convey our cultural pride and our identity. And also, something that we want to acknowledge is that the word disability for so long has been kind of a negative word. It's been limiting, it's been reductive. But what we're seeing now is that the word disability has become something that's growing and enhancing. And so the platform is getting bigger as well. And so we want to be able to stand on that platform and collaborate together. And so it's something that we're just doing now to kind of test and see how it goes, and time will tell.
So, discussing activism, maybe we should also talk about your new billboard, which is up in Hartford in Connecticut.
Sure. So I've got, as you said, a few going on. So I have one in Hartford, Connecticut that I've been commissioned to do through the Collective for Freedoms. And so they've chosen 7 artists to have these billboards go up before the election. And they've asked us each to ask a question in our billboard. And the question I've decided on is the question of, why doubt my experience? And I ask this because as a member of the deaf community, so many of our experiences have been decided by the majority, the hearing community. And so whenever we try to say our own experiences or speak about what we've done because we know it, because we've lived it, we encounter a lot of doubt from people who think they know more, despite not having lived it. So I chose Hartford, Connecticut because I wanted it to be close to the American School for the Deaf, which is the first school for the deaf in the United States.
You're also showing currently a little protest poster at the Jewish Museum in New York. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that as well. And another billboard is for the TED's Climate Conference. What is that?
So I was in a group show that was curated by Jonathan Horvitz at the Jewish Museum in New York. And what they did is choose several protest posters to be a part of that. And what I decided for my piece is to go based off of an experience that I had as a child. You know, as a child, they kind of track your growth, right, from ages 0 to 5. And so I used that charting graphic as the background. And the text that I put on the second one is, learning sign language would make you a better person. And because of that, I'm using my own lived experience. When I was a child, I had acquired language, non-verbally, of course, but before the age of 2, which any child isn't able really to speak until the age of 2, but I had all this language before because I learned sign language. So I kind of wanted to make this piece an homage to all of us who have learned sign language earlier, because I think it makes you a better person. And then the third one is the billboard that I have through TED, and they have the climate countdown. And it's a big event that they're producing. So as a former TED fellow, they kind of asked us to do some public artwork. And I decided to work with my gallery, Gabali Gallery, that's based in LA, to find kind of the right thing to do. And so we decided that there is this one billboard by the 710 freeway by downtown LA. And we kind of thought that that would be a good place to do it because you can see a lot of the smog, a lot of the kind of industrial aspects that, you know, cause our climate to change. And for me, I wanted to acknowledge the urgency of the temperature rising on Earth. And so the third billboard, the third piece reflects that.
Your public appearance is shaped by being both an artist and an activist. So how do they connect, or how do they influence each other?
So I guess what I will say is, when I first started out as an artist, I wanted to kind of, in a sense, not lean so much or express so much about my identity from what I had growing up as a deaf person and using sign language, because I know how society works, I know how society views me. And so I didn't really feel like I was in a position where I wanted to make that the forefront. But now I have a platform where I feel like I have the ability to discuss anything I want. And for me, activism has really kind of started to grow for me as far as my beliefs and my life practices. And so I've been trying to figure out how to incorporate that into my art practices. And I wanted to have some kind of civic responsibility in the work that I produce. I think I can't just have a platform and do nothing. I don't believe in that. I think that I have to have some meaning. And I think a lot of the social movements that we've seen throughout history and the ones that we're seeing now with Black Lives Matter, I think it's really important to be an active member of society. And so that's kind of how I've used my platform.
Super, thank you. Thank you.